This is DW News Africa. Coming up, there has been a steady clip of elections on the continent. But what good has that done for African democracy? Protests and tear gas cloud a controversial win for Cameroon's Paul Biya as the main opposition dismiss his victory as a sham amid a violent government crackdown. Another incumbent takes the vote in Ivory Coast to mixed reaction. Alassane Ouattara supporters celebrate his fourth term as opposition critics point to low turnout and the barring of his two greatest rivals from the race. And protests erupt in Tanzania's main city as millions head to the polls in a ballot marked by human rights concerns. No one doubts that President Samia Suluhu Hassan will retain her grip on power. Welcome to DW News Africa. I'm Michael Oku. Elections are very much alive on the continent, but do the latest three simply prove that African democracy is on life support? Millions have been voting in Cameroon, Ivory Coast, and Tanzania, with the outcome of the polls evident even before the ballot boxes were opened to count the voting slips. One thing the three countries have in common is political continuity. Cameroon's leader stayed the same. Paul Biya has been in power since 1982 and now begins his eighth term. Ivory Coast President Alassane Ouattara, who first came to power in 2010, has been re-elected for a fourth term. And Tanzania's President Samia Suluhu Hassan, contesting her first election, took over in 2021. Her party has ruled Tanzania since independence in 1961 and looks more than likely to retain power. So, what's the story behind their political longevity? Let's first look at Cameroon and the world's oldest serving head of state, 92-year-old Paul Biya, a man often described by analysts and critics as a constitutional monarch without a crown. His re-election for an eighth term has deepened tensions in the Central African nation, where the main opposition leader has pledged to resist Biya's leadership, calling the official result a fictitious victory. Protesters and security forces have clashed in many cities in the buildup and aftermath of the election, as DW News Africa's Blaise Iyong now reports from Cameroon's economic capital, Douala.
Young men blocking roads and setting fires. A visible display of anger in Douala after Paul Biya, Cameroon's longtime leader, was declared the victor in a highly controversial election.
The Cameroonian people, who had long been afraid, found themselves saying, "This is too much," which is why, everywhere, young people who voted overwhelmingly for change find themselves forced to start a revolution. And that's kind of what I see when I look at the cities that are deserted on weekdays. It wasn't a good idea for those in power, even after 43 years, to still try to believe that they can get away with it.
Supporters of opposition leader Issa Chiruma say the election was rigged, with protesters taking to the streets before the result to denounce what they describe as electoral fraud. Tear gas hanging in the air as police try to disperse the crowds. Tensions that have lingered in the days since the vote.
We are simply asking the army to withdraw and stand behind us, because the strength of Cameroon is us, the young people. It's the people who elect the president.
Now aged 92, Paul Biya has ruled Cameroon since 1982, becoming extremely unpopular over the decades in this Central African country. Many blaming him for the problems the country now faces as people look to the polls.
We want change. For example, young people are unemployed. We have degrees and we're unemployed. We need change so that everything will work. And we need peace. Cameroon is not at peace. While we're at peace here in Douala, other parts of the country are not at peace. People aren't in their own homes. Today, we're comfortable here. We come out to vote,
But other people aren't comfortable. They're not going out to vote because there's no peace throughout the country.
Dozens of people have been arrested in connection to the protest, and close to 10 people have been killed. The African Union and the European Union have all raised concerns over the escalating violence. For years, Cameroon has been seen as a stable country in an unstable region. But now, analysts believe if this political tension continue, it could drag the country to difficult days ahead, if not properly managed. Issa Chiruma, Bia's main challenger, and his supporters say they will not accept the results of the election. The government has promised to arrest and prosecute him. More fuel to the fires burning in Cameroon that could lead to further instability across the country.
Controversy also surrounds the presidential election held in Ivory Coast. A ballot won overwhelmingly by the incumbent leader, 83-year-old Alassane Ouattara, who took almost 90% of the vote. But his fourth term was secured in a race without any real heavyweight opposition. His two main rivals were barred from running, former President Laurent Gbagbo for a criminal conviction and ex-Credit Suisse CEO Tidjane Thiam for having acquired French nationality. Around 8.5 million people were registered to cast their ballot, but voter turnout was low, with both Gbagbo and Thiam telling their supporters to boycott the election. Earlier calls for protests by the main opposition also saw deadly unrest in the run-up to the vote, leading to hundreds of activists being arrested and reports of several unexplained disappearances. DW News Africa's Azizit Olaoluwa in Abidjan gave us her assessment of the vote and its fallout.
Activities in Abidjan have returned to normal after provisional results were announced on Monday, showing that President Alassane Ouattara has won a fourth term with over 89% of the total votes in an election with 50.1% voter turnout. The mood across the country is more calm than before the poll, and some Ivorians have told us that now they hope the president will focus on uniting the people, empowering the youth, and also building a stronger economic legacy.
So what about Tanzania? Would the picture look different there in a country where protests are rare and the economy has been performing well? Well, a day of violence as hundreds took to the streets on election day in the commercial capital Dar es Salaam, and allegations from Amnesty International of authorities suppressing the political opposition would suggest not. Challengers to President Samia Suluhu Hassan were either jailed or barred from standing as the nation went to the polls on Wednesday. More than 37 million people were registered to cast their ballot, but turnout was expected to be low. DW News Africa's Sela Oneko reports now on a chaotic election with an all but certain outcome marked by blackouts, curfews, and disruption.
Thousands of people have turned out to the rallies, and one woman is the main attraction. Tanzanian President Samia Suluhu Hassan, who's running for president for the first time. As vice president, she took over 4 years ago when her predecessor died. Being the country's first female leader, Mama Samia, as she's known, sparked hope for democratic reforms. But since then, she's taken a firm grip on Tanzanian politics.
I want to tell you that the only gatherings that will take place are those of people going to the polling stations to vote. There will be no other protests. There will be no security threat. I'm here speaking as the commander-in-chief of this country.
The ruling party's green posters have the best spots in Dar es Salaam. We found only few people who were willing to talk about politics on camera.
My hope is that we'll find a leader who listens, a leader who will be ready to address all the problems of the citizens. My vote will support the leader that I need. There are times when we need a leader who's responsible. There are times when you need a leader who encourages things like peace and other basic needs. If we look at these elections, we see human rights, the opinions of people, and some other things are not being respected. The closure of social platforms like Jamii forums or X, the closure of media houses, and also the prevention of journalists from reporting content that is critical of the government.
Despite the pressure, Simon Malisa is campaigning to become an MP for the small NCCR Mageuzi opposition party.
Most of challenges we face in opposition parties are, first of all, billboards. All large billboards covered by the CCM. Company managers got disturbance from police, also dancers, also people who motivate us.
Tanzania's main opposition party, Chadema, has been reduced to protesting outside the High Court. They were disqualified from running in these elections. And Tundu Lissu, Chadema's would-be presidential candidate, has been behind bars since April, facing treason charges. Police also arrested his deputy outside the court earlier this month. A member of Tundu Lissu's family spoke with DW but didn't want to be identified. They said there was no evidence of treason and the case was a political move to keep him out of the elections. Rights groups have been criticizing the situation for months. Just before the elections, Amnesty International published a report on missing government critics and opposition members.
Some of these people, high-ranking government officials like Humphrey Polepole, who it's now over 3 weeks, his whereabouts are unknown. You also have a case of a TikToker, Shadrach Chaula, who made fun of the president in one of their TikTok posts. The state has got investigative machinery. It has got internal intelligence to find out where these people are. And it is also it creates a lot of fear when people who criticize the state, people who criticize development agenda of a state, just disappear.
The situation attracted international attention this June when two activists from Kenya and Uganda who'd visited Tanzania to observe Tundu Lissu's trial say they were abducted, tortured, and sexually abused. They said by police officers. The government denies any involvement. As Tanzanians head to the polls, the usually peaceful country is more tense than in previous elections.
Again, that report from DW Sela Oneko. Sela also sent us this update from Nairobi.
Elections in Tanzania have not been the quiet affair they usually are. After we saw polling stations open in the morning, we started seeing social media posts of protests from around the country, but especially the commercial capital, Dar es Salaam. As many foreign journalists have been denied entry into the country and local journalists on the ground have found it difficult reporting, it's been difficult to monitor the situation. Prior to the elections, some social media forums, such as Jamii Forum, were also banned. What is worrying around these elections, though, are the reports of arrests and disappearances of government critics. An Amnesty International researcher told us that while they had seen such cases before, the number and also the high profile of the people who have gone missing had reached new levels.
So is the current state of democracy in Africa unpromising, dire, grim? You'd be forgiven for assuming many Africans have lost hope of one day enjoying life under a stable, thriving democracy. But a new opinion poll which surveyed 12,000 people in 10 African countries, including Ivory Coast and Tanzania, offered something else. When asked to choose which factors were holding progress in their country back, more respondents highlighted corruption as a problem, ahead of the lack of political and democratic freedom. Significantly, 70 to 80% of online interviewees in both countries were optimistic about their own personal futures and their countries. To get some perspective on this, I'd like to welcome Dr. Temitayo Odayemi. He's a research fellow in democratic resilience at the University of Birmingham in the UK. His research spans, among other things, democratic engagement and comparative politics, with particular emphasis on Africa. Dr. Odayemi, good to see you.
Good to see you too. Thank you for having me.
Our pleasure. Across Ivory Coast, Cameroon, and I'll include Tanzania because there's little doubt who will be victorious there, We've seen incumbents winning amid allegations of dirty tricks, including their repression of the opposition. Isolated incidents here or examples of a deeper structural problem with electoral democracy in Africa?
Oh, yes, it's more of a problem for democracy, to put it that way, when you have incumbents who have a way of sort of manipulating the process, manipulating institutions to sort of achieve the ends that they do want to achieve, while completely undermining the institutions of state and using them to their advantage. Then that's a big problem for democracy when you have an 83-year-old or thereabout who is going for a fourth term, a 92-year-old who's been in power for more than 4 decades and still going for another term, and the sort of undermining of the opposition, sort of stealing the civic space and making sure that the electoral space is not that free for a fair and credible election. Then that sort of flies in the face whatever it is that democracy is meant to achieve. Okay, the idea of democracy in itself would presuppose that there is a sort of free space for individuals not just to be able to express themselves, but to also be able to aspire to positions. So when you have leaders who are able to manipulate the instrumentalities of the state, the powers that they have to sort of strangulate or sort of undermine the key institution in a way that defies this basic expectation of democracy, then definitely that's a deeper problem for democracy. Something that has been very common to the 3 countries that you mentioned, Ivory Coast, Cameroon, and Tanzania, is that tendency to sort of silence the opposition. So that sort of makes the journey easier. There's less competition, as it were, for the incumbents to sort of retain their power. So that creates a lot of problems, and is something that obviously does not bode well for the idea of democracy in the region.
To underscore that point, some observers say elections have become performative. Do you agree that rather than presenting genuine democratic contests, many elections across the continent have become rituals that ironically allow leaders to avoid real accountability?
Well, I see it more as a mixed bag sort of thing, because we had elections in 2023, in 2024. I remember Liberia in 2023, in 2024 in Senegal, in Ghana. And something that was common to these 3 elections that I've mentioned is the fact that incumbents, whether the incumbent leaders or incumbent political parties, lost election. And the transition was sort of seamless. So that makes it, it's not a one-way direction, to put it that way.
Dr. Temitayo Odayemi, many thanks to you. So how typical are these 3 elections in the bigger picture? A recent report looked at electoral changes of African leaders between 2020 and 2024. It found that during this period, of the 17 multi-party elections where a new leader took office, 11 of them did result in a democratic handover of power, meaning the opposition took control from the governing party through the ballot box. Only in the remaining 6 was there a succession, meaning a new leader took office, but from the incumbent ruling party. We'd like to welcome Kenyan journalist and political commentator Patrick Gathara. So Patrick, would you say we are witnessing a crisis of democracy in Africa, given what we've seen in Ivory Coast, Cameroon, and Tanzania? Or are these exceptions on what's a steady democratic landscape?
I don't think they're exceptions, and thanks for having me. Yeah, they're not exceptions. We've had a period, I think, throughout the 2000s going into the 2020s that where we've seen almost a decline in the hopes of democracy that we'd seen towards the end, I would say, of the 90s, when there was this sort of wave of hope and change that rocked quite a number of countries. I went through a number of countries. We saw changes, democratic changes in places like Malawi, in places like Tanzania, in Kenya itself, where sort of long-term dictatorships were overthrown. But I think that has kind of come to naught. I think over the last 10, 20 years, there's been a steady decline, if you will, in the opportunities for people to be able to express themselves and to push for change within their countries.
Patrick, should we look beyond the electoral process in order to assess the integrity of democracies in countries?
Yeah, for sure. I think elections are a really bad metric for the health of democracies. Autocracies have always been able to hold elections. Again, taking Kenya as an example, we've had elections since the 1960s. Even when we had the dictatorship of President Moi, we had elections every 5 years. So just the fact that you're having elections itself is not a good measure. Secondly, the valorization of elections really reduces participation to simply putting in a ballot or casting a ballot on one day. What a democracy should do and what should be measured is popular participation in the period in between elections. How are people involved in rule? How are people involved in the decisions that dictate their everyday lives? I think that for me would be the measure of democracy, not the fact that you've had an election, and not even the fact that you have changed or thrown out an incumbent. That itself doesn't matter. What really matters is your ability to participate in the years in between elections. And I think those are the metrics we need to be finding ways of measuring and highlighting, not focusing on participation on this one day.
I'm curious about your take on this. Studies find that despite increasing frustration with their democratic governments, 2/3 of Africans still strongly prefer democracy over some other system. Why does that matter?
Well, it does matter because of the promise that our democracy has. And yes, that promise has not been fulfilled in our case, but people can look around the world. People want to be free. Nobody wants to live under a dictatorship. Nobody wants to have his way of life dictated to him, or very few people do. All in all, I think that for most people within the continent, their preferred system would be a system where they participate, where they are free, where they can pursue their dreams and stuff. So I'm not surprised that a lot of them want a democratic system, but they want one that actually works, not something that looks like a democracy, but for all intents and purposes behaves as an autocracy, which in a lot of countries on the continent is what you have. You have the rise of what we termed electoral autocracies. It's autocracies that you vote in, but they never really behave as if they are accountable to you. I think if we were to really get the substance of democracy rather than simply the form of it, then a lot more people, I think, would be willing and happy to participate, and the attraction of sort of the strongman would die down. I'll just say one other thing in this regard. Yes, most people do prefer democracies, but you've had a rise of people wishing for Chinese-style, Singaporean-style autocracies, where they think that let's get a benevolent dictator who will do the right thing. Basically, he will take us out of poverty, institute the nice policies and stuff, and in that sense, we don't really need the chaos and untidiness of democracy. I think we have to be very careful about that because, again, dictatorships are a bet. You are hoping you can get a benevolent dictator because there's no way of guaranteeing that you will. And if you end up with the wrong person, you're stuck with them for a very long time, and it's very difficult to get rid of them. So I always say that it's actually better to go with a messy democracy, which every so often you can try and change. You can try and push. There are ways you can push buttons, rather than a dictatorship, that you hope will be benevolent. And anyway, the history of the world has shown you're much more likely to end up with a Pol Pot or an Idi Amin than you are to end up with Lee Kuan Yew.
Sadly, we'll have to leave it there. Patrick Gathara, many thanks to you.
Thanks for having me.
We end it there, but please do make sure to check out our other stories on dw.com/Africa, or of course on social media. There's a lot of rich material there, and of course original reporting from DW. We'll see you next time. Bye for now.